Today we have the host of Pod Save America and Pod Save the World, Tommy Vietor. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, man. Good to see you again.
So I just want to note, first off, that this interview is being recorded on Thursday, March 3rd. So it'll be a few days before it airs, just flagging because obviously things can shift quickly on the whole Russia-Ukraine front. But jumping into that, as of now, it looks like Ukraine has put up way more of a fight than anyone expected. Then again, I know, just like anybody else, that my perception is colored by what I see on social media, and people want to see Ukraine win. So I'm sure there's a ton of confirmation bias happening right now. Yeah. What's your objective view of this whole thing? And are you as confident that Ukraine's in a decent position here as the media is making it out to be?
I think it's sort of two parts. One, I mean, the Russian invasion didn't start a week ago. It actually started in 2014 when they invaded Crimea and they invaded some eastern parts of Ukraine. So the Ukrainian government has been preparing ever since that day to better professionalize their military. And frankly, it radicalized a lot of the people in Ukraine who decided that, they were not going to be occupied and invaded and they were going to fight back. And so the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian people have shown extraordinary courage. I mean, it's mind-boggling. It's overwhelming to watch the courage and the fight these men and women have put up. And President Zelensky has got to be one of the bravest leaders I can recall in memory. I mean, It is clear that he does not care whether he lives or dies, and he is acting accordingly. And when you see someone put themselves out like that, it's hard not to be inspired. Now, on top of that, what it seems happened was Vladimir Putin's military decided to try to break off small pieces of their army that were mobile, race them towards the capital in hopes that they could get Zelensky to surrender, the Ukrainian army to sort of give up its arms, and end the war before it started, and maybe, outpace Western sanctions or prevent them from happening. That was a massive miscalculation on their part. The Ukrainian people are fighting back. Their army doesn't appear to be as capable as the Russians might have thought it would. And so that's why we've seen, this shocking result over the first week. It's important to note, though, that the vast majority of Russia's military hardware has not been involved in the fight. And those units are slowly making their way towards cities. And when they get there, they will likely start to use increasingly brutal tactics, indiscriminate bombing, massive weapons that have no business in an urban military theater against, civilian targets. So it's going to get a lot worse would be my expectation.
We're hearing about a ton of different countries, a ton of our allies around the world who are sending in supplies and weapons and whatnot. Do you think that those are going to have any mitigating impact when Russia's, real lethal weapons start to make their way into Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's really just a question of logistics. It's a question of how fast can these weapons get there, how much ammo, how much communications equipment, how many sort of advanced pieces of weaponry like anti-tank or anti-aircraft missiles do the Ukrainian military members have left, and how long is this fight? The challenging thing for Russia, if you think about the war in Afghanistan, one of the reasons that war was unwinnable for 20 years is because there was a border between Afghanistan and Pakistan where members of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban could move back and forth and they could get resupplied. That will be the case in Ukraine because the Russians can try to occupy Ukraine, but it is a massive country geographically that borders several NATO states and also has a sea border. So there will be ways to resupply the Ukrainian resistance or the Ukrainian military for as long as they are fighting. But it's just a question of how quickly you can get those arms there.
I'd mentioned that our perceptions are colored by social media, but by the same token, I'm sure the Russian people are consuming news that's colored by their own sources. Is there any indication that the Russian population more broadly is for or against this? Do they think that this is a noble pursuit, or that somehow the U.S. is at fault here, that Russia is just defending itself, or they mentioned that this is all a campaign to fight back against neo-Nazis?
Yeah. It's fascinating to talk about the sort of information warfare piece of this. Ukraine has certainly won the information war in the West and within Ukraine itself. No one believes that Vladimir Putin is going in to denazify Ukraine. Ukrainian people don't
against
want
the president of a country whose own family came from Holocaust victims.
Yeah, I mean, right. Zelensky, one of the only Jewish presidents in the world, is probably not a Nazi. No one believes it. It's nonsense. There's also, there are these inspiring little clips and vignettes of Ukrainian battlefield successes on the internet that I think are inspiring the Ukrainian people and really like helping with their resolve. The question is whether those are representative of how the broader military effort is going, and I suspect that they are not, and that both sides are taking heavy casualties, but ultimately it's a numbers game, and the Russians have a lot more numbers. There have been sort of steady, relatively small but steady protests in Russia every day. Russia is not China. There's not a great firewall. There's not some a government entity blocking the Russian people from getting news. That said, the Russians are slowly and methodically shutting down or silencing, and have been for many decades, frankly, any independent news media members. And their state TV pushes the propaganda line for a living. And so, it's really hard to assess what kind of information the average Russian is getting. If you're young, urban, living in a city, you're online, you're, going on, you can go to nytimes.com. It's just a question if you are. Now, if you're, part of Putin's base, you're older, you live in a more rural area, you're probably watching state TV or radio.
To that point, is the way to end all of this for the Russian people to rise up and take to the streets? Like not to get philosophical, but isn't Putin only powerful insofar as people recognize his power? And so as soon as people rise up against him, he loses that power because no one's immune to pressure?
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, my concern is this, that Vladimir Putin has defined himself as this strong man who's all powerful, who's, representing a rising, reemergent Russia on the world scene. And that he might view any capitulation, any sign of weakness as an existential problem for him personally, in that, maybe it would lead to a coup, maybe it would lead to some general trying to push him out or off him. And so I do worry that, Putin is going to grind this war out and fight to a bitter end, even if he takes serious losses, unless there is some sort of domestic pressure that forces him to stop. Because I do take Joe Biden at his word that he doesn't want the US or NATO to get involved, because that would literally constitute World War III, and there's a huge downside risk.
Do you think that pressure among Russians is going to rise, as people start to feel more squeezed, as inflation skyrockets and the ruble becomes more worthless and their wealth is wiped out in the market and so on?
That's the single most important question. It seemed early on that Vladimir Putin was trying to hide this war effort, not only from his own troops, but from the Russian people. That's not a choice anymore. They're watching their economy crater. They are losing their ability to travel abroad. They are losing their access to international markets. You're going to feel this if you're an average Russian. The question always becomes, okay, do the people getting hurt blame it on the government, or do they blame it on the West? And I just never know how this is going to go. On top of that, I mean, Putin has made suppression of speech, it's an art form for him. That he has shock troops out in the street beating the shit out of people probably as we speak, or who are showing dissent. So that's always the question, is will there be a spark that leads to enough people having enough courage at the same time to hit the streets?
I know you'd mentioned the prospect of a nuclear war. How do you think that legacy media is taking this? I know you responded on Twitter to a really glib suggestion from a reporter that our options are basically just sitting with our thumbs up our asses or dropping nukes and nothing in between. And yet, we're seeing right now that if the world is unified, that economic war can have really devastating impacts for an invading country.
Yeah, look, I feel a little bit bad that I picked on that reporter, but there is sometimes in foreign policy reporting this suggestion that either you respond to something militarily or you're doing nothing. And like you just said, I mean, the sanctions that Joe Biden and the Europeans have put in place on Russia go so far beyond anything I ever could have expected that it is economic warfare. I mean, these sanctions will crater the Russian economy, full stop. And so that is an enormous lever that the West is using against this Russian intervention. So I do hope we can get past this false choice in this debate that I saw in Afghanistan and Syria and Iraq and so many other times that either the U.S. Intervenes militarily or it's doing nothing. Because frankly, I saw the U.S. intervene in a lot of places during my time in the Obama administration, like Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. And, there are second, third, fourth order consequences. And sometimes we can do more harm than good. And we should just be honest about that.
We're coming off of a 20-year war that the second it ended basically reverted right back to where they were before we got there. So, I think that should kind of underscore how like this approach isn't necessarily like the end all be all where it's just like drop bombs and then we'll win,
That's right. Yeah. It is. The U.S. military is the most lethal fighting force in the history of the world. But there is always something that comes after that narrow military victory. And that's the hard part. And there's sort of like a political reconciliation that needs to happen here.
Now, Russia seems to be holding its own for now, but like it's still evident that the rest of the world isn't willing to engage in a direct conflict with Russia. You just mentioned like not wanting to basically, start World War III, engage with another nuclear power. Do you think that there's a chance that China sees the world's restraint in the face of such blatant aggression by Russia and like takes that as tacit permission to go into Taiwan, for example, or some other territory that it views as their own, knowing that they're basically going to have a free runway to do so? I mean, there might be economic sanctions, but there's not going to be any military action by the West.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a good question. It's a hard one to answer. I mean, I do think that there's a good chance that the Chinese look at what's happening to the Russians economically and they think, oh, wow, the world actually has a lot more guts and is willing to take a lot harder actions than we anticipated. So that might raise the cost of an annexation.
With that said, though, I mean, Russia is not China, and like it's easy to kind of cut Russia out of the world order because they don't make anything. I mean, China,
Absolutely.
so much of the world is like predicated on Chinese manufacturing. I mean, it's intertwined in a way that no other country on the planet is.
Absolutely. I mean, look, we get a lot of stuff from China. Our supply chains are way too dependent on China. I think we learned that during the pandemic. There's a lot of risks there that could come from sort of a decoupling of our economy and the Chinese economy. That said, there's a lot of risks that could come for Europe if they decouple their economy from Russia's because they are so dependent on Russia for oil and gas, and it's like literally freezing in the middle of winter in someplace like Poland, and all of a sudden your natural gas prices could double or triple if things go the wrong direction. So, but like seeing these countries make a lot of tough choices, and so I know I've been kind of heartened by the willingness of global leaders to take hard choices in the face of a madman. What it says to China in terms of Taiwan, I don't know, but like Taiwan is the place where all these, advanced processors are made that power all of our computers, all of our smartphones, all of our cars. And if you had a war that looked like what we're seeing in Ukraine, in Taiwan, it would set the world back eons. It's just something to be mindful of.
Also, something to be mindful of is the fact that Democrats introduced the America Competes Act, bringing this domestic semiconductor chip industry here. And one Republican voted for it. That was Adam Kinzinger. Every other Republican voted against funding the domestic semiconductor chip industry. So
that would be a good idea that we might want to get on.
Yeah. Back home, we've seen people like Trump and Tucker Carlson really lead the pro-Putin ranks here in this country. Do you think that pushes anyone on the right away? Or is it just like everything else where their values are so malleable that Trump just says something and then suddenly that becomes their new guiding principle?
That's a really great question. I was thinking about that today. I mean, it is just staggering to think that a week ago, Tucker Carlson was asking aloud to his audience, why do I dislike Putin? What's the problem with Putin? It is mind-boggling that a couple weeks ago, Donald Trump was suggesting that this invasion by Putin of Ukraine was smart and that he was getting, a country on the cheap. I think that those comments look so disgusting in light of what's happened a week later that I'm hopeful that they will repulse people. I mean, there have been bigger polls done since the invasion about like sort of Putin's approval, what people think of the intervention, and the country is overwhelmingly anti-Putin. They're overwhelmingly opposed to what he's doing to Ukraine, and this glib crap from Tucker Carlson or Trump, I really don't think has played well.
The last thing here, that's during Biden's State of the Union, we heard Lauren Boebert heckle the president while he was in the middle of talking about burn pits and also his son who just passed away. Is there anything that'll ever be too far, or is the Overton window just like on a perpetual sprint to the right with no end in sight?
I know, man. I hate it. It's like the members of Congress just get dumber every year, and people are willing to do more outlandish, disgraceful things to get attention. And the problem is, like, the minute they did that little shouting bit, they won because it got covered. It became a thing that people focused on, whether you're for them or against them. They fundraise off it. They raise money off it. They are backbench, powerless, lame members of Congress who we've only heard of because they do these disgraceful things. So it's just like we live in this world now where there's so many incentives to just act in the worst way possible, whether you're an elected official or, like one of the Paul brothers walking around some forest in Japan, and like all of these disgusting things get rewarded. And I have no idea what to do about it, but it's a huge problem.
One major issue at a time. Anyway,
Yeah.
Tommy, thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it. I love, I thought you only interview presidents now, but I'm glad you still let please like me on.